Kristen Moretto. I'm the Assistant Director for Service Learning here at UNCG. We're very excited to have Harry Boyte with us and very thankful that he took the time to travel and spend the day with us. It's been a great day so far, and I'm excited to hear his comments tonight. Harry founded what is now named the Sabo Center for Democracy and Citizenship at Augsburg College, where he serves as Senior Scholar in Public Work and Philosophy. He's also a Senior Fellow at the University of Minnesota and a visiting professor at the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University in South Africa. Harry has a wealth of experience in academic, civic, and community work upon which to draw for his talk to us tonight. He's authored 8 books on democracy, citizenship, and community organizing, including his newly released volume, Democracy's Education, Public Work, Citizenship, and the Future of Colleges and Universities. I believe his time with us today will inspire us to public work that promotes positive change in our professions, institutions, and communities. So Harry, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kristen, and Kathy Hamilton and the Office of Leadership and Service Learning, Christina, everyone who is involved, the co-sponsors. I want to express real pleasure for being here. So I graduated from Grimsley, Greensboro in 1963. And this morning, on an early morning run, I ran by the high school. And that was really interesting. That's changed a little bit, but it brought back many memories. And I guess especially it brought back a sense of the turbulence of those days and the movement which shaped me as a young man. I worked as a field secretary for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Martin Luther King's organization. My dad was on the executive committee of SCLC after being manager of the Red Cross and having become involved in school desegregation efforts. So a lot of my worldview was shaped by that great movement. And I want to say, as difficult as it may be to imagine for some, I think we're on the threshold of another movement. For the revitalization and the deepening of American democracy. And I'll describe more what I mean by that. It's often not remembered today in accounts of the great freedom movement that Martin Luther King often described it as both realizing the promise of democracy which had been long denied African Americans, and also bringing the country back to the great wells of democracy, as he put it in the letter from a Birmingham jail, which had been forgotten. And this was the aftermath of the 1950s, the famous Richard Nixon vice president debate with Nikita Khrushchev, the head of the Communist Party in Russia, in which Nixon defined democracy as consumer choice in a famous debate in the US model kitchen in Moscow. So we've seen a kind of narrowing again of democracy. But what I want to do today is talk about 3 things. One, the democratic spirit of higher education, which full of complexities nonetheless was once vibrant and powerful and inspiring to the nation, and meant far more than democracy means today. Secondly, where did that democratic spirit go? I'm not going to spend detailed discussion of that, but it's important to note it, that the shrinking has real causes that can be understood, and higher education is not innocent in that process. And thirdly, how can we take the future in our hands by revitalizing a really strong sense of the democratic spirit throughout higher education, and see that as catalyzing a democratic process and energy and hopefulness and spirit in the society? I think the future of our democracy is inextricably tied to the culture and the spirit of higher education. That's my fundamental argument. And as higher education recovers a sense of democratic purpose, it will also have in interaction with others, tremendous effect throughout society. And this is partly meaning also returning to the sense of higher education as a movement, not a bureaucracy. David Matthews in the Democracy's Education book has a nice phrase that higher education once saw itself as a movement, not a bureaucracy. So it's returning to the roots of higher education as a democratic and democracy-building movement. So, and the third thing I want to talk about is how can we revitalize the democratic purpose and spirit story of higher education? And I'll mention three things. It seems to me that we're on the threshold of the engagement movement, another stage of the engagement movement in higher education. The pedagogies we need involve building on what's called high-impact practices, active learning, but going beyond those to focus on education for civic agency, individual and collective empowerment, and I'll give a story or two. Secondly, revitalizing the sense that higher education, both in its campuses and in the larger society, can be a tremendously important force in catalyzing and architecturally building public spaces for deliberation, for work, for crossing differences. And that's an urgent need in our society, which is so polarized and fragmented, and there's a great hunger for public spaces. And thirdly, we need to develop a habit of thinking in much larger terms than we often think about, beyond issues and particular campaigns and particular programs. We need to get ourselves in the habit of thinking about the larger purposes of education. And that also has real resemblance to the freedom movement. So those are my themes tonight. I don't really have to go into too much detail in North Carolina about the emerging attack on higher education. But I want to just begin by saying you're not alone. So the governor of Arizona has recently proposed zeroing out of the state budget all funding for the two largest community college systems in Arizona. And of course, many of you would have heard that Scott Walker and the governor of Wisconsin proposed cutting $300 million from the University of Wisconsin budget, and at the same time excising the land grant mission from the university's purposes. So what's going on? And what does this represent? That's really what I want to address tonight. Come in. Hi, Deborah. Well, let me begin by talking about the shrinking of democracy briefly and how we once had a much larger sense. Democracy has a specific definition today on the site and the strategic plan of the USAID, the aid program around the world. And it reads like this. Democracy refers to a civilian political system in which the legislative and chief executive offices are filled through regular competitive elections with universal suffrage. That is the definition of democracy, which is the official, as close to as an official definition as we can find. So it's entirely focused on elections. And it reflects, in fact, a long developing tradition in political science crystallized by Seymour Martin Lipset in his famous book, Political Man in 1960. So it's not simply recent. But the striking thing is the way that contrasts to the understanding of democracy in President Truman's Commission on Higher Education in 1947, which defined democracy as a society, not simply elections, and defined the purpose of higher education as the carrier, the essential charge, the most essential charge of higher education is that in every aspect it shall be the carrier of democratic values, ideals, and processes. So we've seen a shrinking, a dramatic shrinking. And I would say it also informs a certain sense of exhaustion and despair among many intellectuals. So Mark Little, the well-known social theorist at Columbia in the New Republic last year, wrote, "Never since the end of World War II, and perhaps since the Russian Revolution, has political thinking in the West been so shallow and clueless." It goes on to say that our ways of thinking about political and social theory do not match the great challenges we face as a society and as a world. But let me recall earlier understandings of democracy, which were very alive in the movement that shaped me as a young man in the civil rights movement. University of North Carolina at Greensboro was, of course, founded in 1891 as a women's college. McKiver, Kathy Hamilton told me a wonderful quote of McKiver, the founder, who said, "You educate a man and you educate a person, you educate a woman and you educate a family." But the context of that sense of mission and change and broadening education was also a deep transformation in understandings of education in America. It was perhaps most vividly expressed by the president of University of Michigan, Engel, who was president from the 1870s to the early 20th century, who declared the purpose of education is to animate and serve the democracy. And that required there be a democratic spirit throughout the whole of the University of Michigan. And this meant specific things that took shape in the public universities across the country and land-grant colleges and places like City College in New York. So this meant at the University of Michigan, which, by the way, was a formative experience for the philosopher John Dewey in those years, it meant a spirit of intellectual inquiry and discussion across disciplinary boundaries. It meant active learning, a shift from a lecture system to a seminar system. It meant admitting women. It was an integrated school. It had been integrated for some time. It meant working in a collaborative way with community partners. So John Dewey was involved in a democracy school initiative with the schools in the state of Michigan. And more broadly, as this understanding of the democratic spirit of higher education took shape in the early decades of the 20th century, full of contradiction, but the University of Minnesota was a good case. It had several dimensions, which subsequently shrunk. So there was a spirit of inquiry, of openness, of public space. There was an active learning culture. There was a strong sense of being part of the state, not partners with the state. But Lotus Kaufman, the president of the University of Minnesota in the 1920s and 30s, in his inaugural address, which was named the University in the Commonwealth, in which he concluded by saying the University of Minnesota will always be of the Commonwealth, by the Commonwealth, and for the Commonwealth as long as I'm here as president, and said that this means we will never climb up on some Mount Olympus far from the common lot. Said the University of Minnesota is not the property of those at the University of Minnesota, and it's not the creation of those at the University of Minnesota. It is a social product of the labors of the people of the state and reflects the soul hunger. This is the president of a public university, the soul hunger of the common people of Minnesota, and it functions as a guardian of democracy. Now, that was not only a statement, but it reflected some realities that are important. A much more porous interaction with the society and a different sense of relationship. So the cooperative extension system at the university, a land grant, meant that faculty members and students who worked in the greater Minnesota were constantly told, as the soil conservation scientists were told, when you work in Minnesota, you have a specialty, but the more important task is to get to understand the community you're working with. So soil conservation scientists all across the state in the 1930s were told, this was also, by the way, the policy of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, soil conservation scientists were told the community's knowledge is prior to yours. And don't sound off about soil conservation until you really get to know the community, its history, its culture, its politics, its divisions, its controversies, its complexities. And then you can do something constructive. That's why we have such a remarkable system of contour farming in Minnesota. It also meant that the students developed a sense of themselves as becoming citizen professionals in their careers. An example in the 1920s was Hubert Humphrey, his father. Humphrey was the vice president, and before that, the senator from Minnesota. Humphrey's father, a druggist and a small businessman in Dolan, South Dakota, a town in South Dakota of 600, his whole career saw himself as a civic businessman whose work was to make that drugstore the civic center of that community. And this was crossing partisan lines. Humphrey's father was one of 6 Democrats in a town of 600 Republicans. So again, you may feel a little lonely these days, but recall Hubert Humphrey's father. And Humphrey said that he learned about politics and he learned about the meaning of citizenship from his father's drugstore. Well, that was also true for the civic business leadership of the Twin Cities. We had a public engagement task force in the early 2000s looking at the renewal of the land grant mission. And I coordinated the community partnership piece. We had all sorts of discussions with business, with African American clergy, with teachers, with state legislators. Again and again, when we ask people what should be the role of a great public university in a flourishing democratic society, you get a completely different discussion than if you ask, what should the University of Minnesota be doing? What you mainly got was a sense of the erosion of the civic dimensions of their own settings. So business talking about the loss of the old 10% club, where businesses were expected to give back 10% of their profits in Minnesota and St. Paul to the civic infrastructure and life of the Twin Cities. Or the legislators who said, you know, the tradition in Minnesota was to see yourself as a citizen legislator, grounded in the life of places, not a professional outside. So there's a very rich tradition of democracy and democratic spirit in higher education. I could go on, and I could go on about the complexities, but the complexities also had their complexities. So the University of Minnesota's residence halls were segregated. They admitted African American students. But this also had a positive for all the terrible qualities of that. So the students, black students at the University of Minnesota, lived in the settlement houses across the Twin Cities. There were 14, including Phyllis Wheatley, and they were regularly expected to actually educate the children of communities in what they're learning in the University of Minnesota. And Phyllis Wheatley itself was probably the intellectual powerhouse. It's an African-American settlement in Minneapolis. It was an intellectual powerhouse. Gertrude Brown, the director, made a very strong partnership with the Harlem Renaissance. So there was constantly a stream of great intellectuals like W.B. Du Bois and artists and musicians and poets like Langston Hughes. So this, okay. This is meant to convey something of the spirit of struggle. Of building the Commonwealth, of democratic energy, and of the centrality of education to this. This is by a Harlem Renaissance artist, Hale Woodworth, who wrote this as part of a series called The Negro in California. The centerpiece is Open Schools for Our Children. You see the issues of struggle for an inclusive democracy, but also the idea of building the Commonwealth and gaining authority and strength and power from that imagery, from that narrative. It's a narrative, of course, which was central to the Harlem Renaissance. A great figure in the understanding of democracy in those years was Alain Locke, the first African-American Rhodes Scholar. And actually, I remember Martin Luther King comparing Locke to Aristotle and Plato. He was a philosopher. And he was the architect of the Harlem Renaissance conceptually. Locke, in his writings in 1930s, said if we are going to have effective democracy in America, we must have the democratic spirit. This requires social, cultural, economic democracy in order to keep any kind of political democracy. He also saw democracy's fate as inseparably linked to the freedom struggle, the pivotal place of the minority situation in the present-day battlefront of democracy, and the critical need for social and cultural democracy as a bulwark of any serious democracy. So democracy was a living, breathing notion of a way of life. There was a work in progress, a journey, not a destination, but it involved deepening democracy in every setting. Now, this is what I learned in the citizenship schools of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. In fact, the mission of the citizenship education program that SCLC took over from Highlander Folk School in 1961 was written by Septimer Clark, and the mission of the citizenship education program was to deepen the democratic qualities of every relationship. Every relationship. So it was about an expansive view of democracy. One of the things that Locke was passionate about, that he declared in his manifesto called The New Negro in 1925, which was a kind of manifesto for the Harlem Renaissance, was African Americans are contributors and creators of American democracy, not a problem to be solved. And he fulminated against the notion that African Americans were seen as problems to be solved, or they were wards, or they were some group that progressive, well-intentioned liberals were supposed to fix. I would say the biggest problem in the shrinking of democracy is we've changed that mindset, not only about poor African Americans, but about many groups. We've developed an approach that is about fixing people. And this is connected to changes in higher education. So in his recent book, Science, Democracy, and the American University, the Harvard historian Andrew Jewett traces in great detail the changing understandings of science from the first half of the century to the years of the Cold War. And Jewett describes how John Dewey, the philosopher of democracy, whose centennial of his great work, Democracy in Education, will be next year, Dewey was not a singular figure. Dewey was part of a very broad movement of scientists and philosophers of science who saw science itself as most importantly a set of cultural practices to build democracy, like free inquiry and a commitment to the commonwealth of knowledge, and testing ideas in practice, looking for evidence of many kinds. Albert Einstein was certainly part of this movement, said the problems of the future of humanity will be solved in the village square. But Jewett also describes how in the 1960s and beyond, a particular view of science that changed that understanding of science as cultural democracy and scientists as scientific democrats took hold. The scientists who powerfully shaped the national discourse on science in the middle years of the 20th century and after drew a sharp line between science and society. There'd always been a small group that felt science was outside, but Jewett describes actually this became the norm, the dominant discourse. They portrayed science as utterly deaf to human concerns and sought to insulate the research process as a space untouchable by both the state and the horizontal communication with other citizens. So in this process, scientists begin to see themselves not as citizens, but outside the common life of the citizenry. Now, if you think about it, this has affected every profession. So careful attention to the language of professions, whether in science or education or government practice, talks about engaging citizens, doing things for and to citizens, but there's a distinction between professional practices and citizen practices. We found this when we did a project with the Clinton administration from 93 to 95, and we interviewed hundreds of people in government who were able to trace actually that process to the 1950s, when civil servants began to stop seeing themselves as citizens. As one put it, we've lost the civil in civil service. And the battle we had in the 1990s in the Clinton administration was the redefinition of citizens as customers of government. Customers of government. And we can talk more in the question and answer. There's a lot to be said about this. But exploring and looking at both contemporary understandings and self-understandings of professions and older practices of profession shows a striking change. And ironically and poignantly, this is true even for those in higher education often who call for re-engagement with the world, who call for attention to human concerns. So the key figure here, a really important voice, was Donna Shalala, Chancellor of the University of Wisconsin in the 1980s, who gave a very important speech at the University of Illinois called Mandate for a New Century on the mission of higher education in the new century, and called for a revival of the Wisconsin idea, which was the language for the Wisconsin land-grant mission. But it was very different than Lotus Kaufman's notion of the university as part of the life of the state. Shalala, I have a portrait a picture that this is from the breadline in Washington. I think it shows what happens when you get this view of the role of professionals and scientists. Am I going to be able to do this? I'm kind of a techno-peasant.
Oh, okay. It's this one, the right side.
Okay. It's the one below. So this is a statue of the breadline in Washington, but the reason I use it because it shows a view of the people. This is one of George Siegel's statues. There are two statues of ordinary citizens of breadline this is breadline and the rural couple. In both cases, citizens appear as pitiable. And the message is that the New Deal fixed and solved the problems of the American people. I'd seen this the same day I'd seen the New Deal for the art. Pictures like the Woodruff mural, which was a completely different message about the energy and the agency of the people. So Donna Shalala's Mandate for the New Century speech redefined the land-grant mission, this is the exact language, as the revival of a technocratic elite of the nation's best and brightest in service to the neediest, fixing America's problems through the miracles of science. So that's a shift to a one-way view of higher education's role and the land-grant role that is outside the citizenry, not part of the citizenry. In fact, the old Wisconsin idea language had the idea that higher education was a stimulus from within the society, from within Wisconsin. That language was missing from the Shalala speech. And so Shalala's speech was full of good intentions from a progressive point of view. I mean, she names the problems of racism and poverty and environmental degradation and global warfare and sexism and homophobia, but her solution is for the best and the brightest to fix these problems. So I think we have a cultural challenge to overcome that continues, that as faculty we often are taught to see ourselves outside the society, observing, criticizing, perhaps preparing our students to help, but there's rarely in our education the notion that we are citizens who learn the skills of collective, common, collaborative work with other citizens. A big shift. So you compare that concept with the earlier land-grant concept. So Liberty Hyde Bailey, the Dean of Agriculture at Cornell, the founding philosopher of the cooperative extension system of America, was very clear that whatever your specialty, when you graduate from Cornell, he was the Dean of Agriculture, whatever your specialty, your more important work is to look for occasions for communities to increase their own capacity for agency and self-action. And as he said again and again, it was a constant refrain, people's salvation can never come from outside. It has to come from within, from the capacities within. So there's a huge shift in sensibility and identity in practice. Okay, so what can be done? Let me sketch 3 dimensions. I think we're on the cusp of a new pedagogy, a new educational philosophy, which I would call education for civic agency. It builds on something like the AAC and U high impact practices, more active learning, but it has a much more explicit attention to skills of collective action to solve problems. I also think, interestingly, there is the sense of agency and civic agency emerging across disciplines. I was involved in a group which included the late Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in 2009 for her work on citizen-centered governance of common pool resources around the world. But the civic agency field that we founded, that there's an institute every summer at Tufts University, is about how do disciplines, fields of knowledge, contribute to the empowerment of the citizenry. And that means scholars seeing themselves as citizens, not asking how can we inform citizens, but how can we participate as citizens in the work of addressing the challenges we face. So we see this emerging in different fields, and one of our interesting conversations recently has been with executive function scientists in early childhood education who are focusing very strongly on education on the basis of thousands of studies of how infants develop. But let me just tell you a story. So in 1990, when we, not long after we came to the Humphrey Institute, and the dean had asked me to come in, she had seen some work on citizenship and the concept of free spaces. Harlan Cleveland asked me to come and set up a project on democracy at Humphrey. I didn't want to do an academic outside study. We wanted to develop theory, but grounded theory. So we developed partnerships. We basically posed the question, how can you push back against this technocratic creep, this narrowing of the sense of professionals as being part of the society, the transformation of places like settlement houses or schools or clinics or businesses from civic sites in the life of communities to service providers. That's been our mission. But one of the pieces was we wanted to do a youth initiative that taught young people the skills of civic agency, of acting collectively with power. We started off by asking 21 groups of teenagers in the Twin Cities, every kind of group, from the jails to the suburbs. If there were problems they worried about, every group had a long list. They varied, but every group had a long list, from crime and drive-bys and drugs and schools that didn't make sense to global warming, or environmental degradation in those years, racism, crime. Every group had a long list, but the second question was really telling in our answers. So we asked, do you think you can do anything about these problems? And what we heard was, first, no, we've never had a class in that. So a lot of these students had done service projects. So they weren't confusing being able to take action on problems they worried about with service. They weren't against service, they just was different. And then secondly, and this was really striking, they said, again and again, nobody's ever asked us that question. So they were growing up in cultures where there was very diminished expectation of what young people might do in terms of working on the problems that they faced in their lives. So public achievement developed, and it's a long history. It's a powerful, we called it public achievement. Young people work as a team over usually a year. They're coached often by college students. We had a sloppy first year with a lot of mistakes, but we developed a partnership with the low-income Catholic school, elementary school in St. Paul, St. Bernard's, whose principal then is now the international organizer for public achievement. It became the spirit of the school, and it affected not only the students, but the teachers and the pedagogies and the culture of the school in really striking ways. So that's always been our approach. We don't see it as a program, we see it as an educational transformative initiative. And Dennis Donovan continues that spirit of, he always wanted to change education. And while at St. Bernard's, we saw tremendous things that kids did, some not always, sometimes just small things or failures, but we all saw great learning. But, you know, like a group of 5th and 6th graders who worked 4 years to build a playground in a neighborhood that was neighbors thought was too dangerous. They had to negotiate zoning changes and raise money from local businesses and change around the neighborhood. Imagine 5th and 6th graders developing the skills to do that. And that school was so successful, such a vital site that people started coming from different countries. Public achievement is now in 23 countries. It takes different forms, but it's always the same kind of core civic agency. We moved our center to Augsburg partly out of the calculation that faculty at Augsburg in different departments would have more freedom to innovate and take something like public achievement and integrate it into their training of their students, education of their students. And the special education program at Augsburg leapt at the chance. Special education, as many of you know, is the designation of an education which is supposed to remediate kids who are problem kids, who have various kinds of disabilities. In most schools in the country, it's often meant to keep kids out of trouble, and it often is terrible in its effects because it stigmatizes individual kids. And the internal critique of special education is, from disability studies, is that it stigmatizes individuals without problematizing or asking questions about the school culture. And often kids in special education are creative or they're feisty. They don't want to sit and listen to teachers signing off, or they have difficulties making relationships, or whatever, but it doesn't really address the cultural and relational issues of special education very well, of the kids. So the striking thing about Augsburg from the very beginning was that special education faculty and working with graduate students and dentists began to work with a middle school, Fridley Middle School. And there's a great video, by the way, called Public Achievement in Fridley, Transforming Special Education, a YouTube video. And these kids who were locked away in the level 3 EBD special education program developed, well, the teachers, Michael Ritchie and Alyssa Blood, changed the curriculum. So it was an empowering approach rather than a behavioral or medical approach. So these kids developed skills of taking effective action and building relationships and understanding where people are coming from and understanding the politics of environments, and developed profiles as public leaders in Fridley. There's a very good Minnesota Public Radio program on the transformation of special education at Fridley and how these kids became leaders on issues like school bullying and cruelty to animals and healthy lifestyles, many issues. So special education since then at Augsburg has transformed itself. So while the effects on the changes in kids are remarkable, the changes in teachers are equally remarkable. And perhaps in the discussion I'll read some quotes. But the teachers, both the Fridley teachers and the special education teachers, the students, think about them, their teaching is different. They use the language of citizen teacher. They see themselves as transforming special education. Special education at Augsburg is now working with 14 area schools in the Twin Cities, schools with all sorts of special education programs about autism and physical disabilities and level 3 EBD, and with the mission of changing special education from a medical model to an empowerment approach. Thanks, Kathy. We would say that's shifting from a focus on workforce preparation to a focus on preparing students to do public work. Work that's large in its public impact, that's public, that's collaborative, that's a very different kind of work, that's attentive to the changes we need in different fields. We've also been working with the nursing program, this PhD program in transcultural nursing, and recently scientists in other fields. So I think there's a new challenge in pedagogy, which is how do we really develop the capacities to educate our students to be change agents in their professions, in their careers, in their institutions. Secondly, and let me just note this, we've seen a lot of potential for revitalizing the idea that higher education has a tremendous opportunity in a society which is fragmented and polarized to help create public spaces for deliberation, for discourse, for engagement across polarized politics, cultural differences, religious differences. And one of our favorite stories, I was telling Barry, is with libraries. So we have a lot of work with immigrants, and in the west side of St. Paul, the Riverview Library, which is an old library, the west side is a historical immigrant settlement area. Riverview Library decided that actually immigrants weren't going to come to them. They didn't know anything about the library. So they had to change their understanding of what it meant to be a librarian. They had to develop skills of community organizing and going out and getting to know people, interacting with people, inviting people in, and creating new opportunities for public space, for conversations, for interaction, for getting to know native-born Americans. So the library in Riverview became public space. Now, I would say, and again, we could talk more about this, there are opportunities for developing public space on campuses and through partnerships are immense. So every classroom can become a public space for deliberation, for discussion, for voicing different points of view. It takes particular skills, but one of the pieces of work we do is called deliberative practices, where students learn to weigh different points of view, to listen to other viewpoints. Obviously, in co-curricular activities and residence halls and student activities, there are immense opportunities for public space. And thirdly, let me conclude by saying this is really all about thinking bigger. So the freedom movement, which shaped me, was a movement to challenge Americans to think in bigger ways. And that was true for people in the movement, and it was true for the larger society. So King's point that America has both always denied the promise of democracy to African Americans, but it's also forgotten what democracy means. That was a continuous theme. And if you look at his letter, his March on Washington, I Have a Dream speech, people focus on the I Have a Dream, but it's important to notice that the whole speech was first of all framed as a message to most Americans. The March organizer, Bayard Rustin, who was a great strategist of the movement, by the way. He's the guy in Selma, in the movie, in the documentary, the guy with frizzy hair and glasses who's talking about tactics. That's Bayard Rustin. He was the great strategist. Bayard Rustin, who was the organizer for the March on Washington, its analysis, and this was a constant theme in SCLC, was that a third of America, maybe 30%, are for the movement. A third are against die-hard segregationists, including in those years most of my family, the extended family. That leaves the challenge of the movement to win over 40% of America. And if you look at Selma, that's a very strong theme in the movie. So thankfully, it raises the question of the strategic acumen in insight. But Martin Luther King's speech was also framed in those ways. So, for example, he calls for a vision of an inclusive dream. He also says, let us not drink from the cup of bitterness, but rise to the occasion of discipline. Bayard Rustin, who had been actually probably the most important figure in bringing nonviolence, it was a Quaker background, Bayard Rustin saw nonviolence as a way of disciplining anger and teaching a sense of human beings as immensely complicated, not divisible into the damned and the righteous, that everyone had possibilities of redemption. And that spirit was throughout SCLC. So I want to say, what does this mean in our time? It means higher education that begins to breathe a spirit of larger democracy, that communicates that possibility to the larger society. We've seen examples in our own partnership networks of places like Lone Star Community College, where the public achievement leadership in the social science department has actually connected to a faction of the Tea Party who concerned about local power and local voice and who think higher education should become public spaces. Jay Tice wrote a column with the local Tea Party leader, and as a result of that, in the last election, a bond issue passed for the first time in several election cycles for an increase in funding for community colleges. Now, Jay Tice talks all the time about a larger understanding of democracy in which citizens are at the center and people are empowered. And that has appeal across partisan lines. So I would just conclude with a passage I use from Walt Whitman. Remembering the possibilities of democracy is a journey, not a destination. We have frequently printed the word democracy. This is from Democratic Vistas. This is Walt Whitman, the great poet of democracy. Yet I can not too often repeat, it is a word the real gist of which still sleeps, quite unawakened, notwithstanding the resonance and the angry tempests out of which its syllables have come. It is a great word whose history remains unwritten because the history has yet to be enacted. So our challenge is to see ourselves as enacting a history which is in the future, not the past. So thank you.